Well, it's a small world, the old gambling world. I used to work for Mark Phillips's dad, actually, Dave.
Yeah, of course,
second bookie. Yeah. So, what happened after that?
They were bought by a company called Centrebet and moved to Australia, and I didn't go. So I ended up working in Malta for the infamous John Thompson, and had a year out there working for a Swedish firm, but all sort of British traders, all been brought in by John. Lived out in the sun for a year, which as a 24-year-old guy was great fun. I went over there, and I still, looking back now, was still absolutely clueless, and learnt a lot while I was over there. And while I was there, I think I get my first sort of lucky break, if you like. I'm a great believer that in anyone's career, you get a few nice breaks along the way. And there was a merger between a company that were out there called Heathorns. They were a big old-fashioned racing firm. Or not big, they weren't big by that stage, but they had been a big racing firm, and they were on the rails. I'm sure you'd have known them there, Simon, as well. And they merged with a company called Centrebet that had been owned by Tony Bloom, but he'd sold them. And they were bought by an American company called Interactive Gaming Holdings. Now, their problem was that they were absolutely clueless and had no idea what they were buying. But they were looking for a head trader. And they offered the job originally to a guy that I knew out in Malta. And at the last minute, he turned it down. He had a Maltese wife, and she didn't want to move to London. So he turned it down. And the boss at Heathorns was a guy called Andy Collins, who's now the betting ring inspector, I think, on the Northern courses. Lovely guy and a fellow Wolves fan like myself. And Andy said to me, "How do you fancy it then? How do you fancy this head trader's role?" And I've been a trader at a lower level for a couple of years, just scratching about, learning off more experienced people than myself. And 2.5 years in, I got offered a chance to go and be a senior trader at these firms, and that really accelerated my career. I went there and I took the job, and it was probably a year or two too early for me, looking back. But I got through it, and from there I ended up going to be the head of trading at Stan James in Gibraltar. Had a year, 18 months out there. Enjoyed it, but Gibraltar was one of those places for me that I had to get out of. I knew that it wasn't wasn't where I was going to stay long term. I didn't want to be there any longer than I had to. And the head of football job came up at Coral. And I met a group of people that were making a decision on that, one of which was Simon Clare. And although sort of the PR director, Simon was involved heavily in that decision-making process. And he was a big advocate of mine. I was still young, I was still 28 at the time, which was young to go into a big firm and be fairly senior. And Simon really batted my corner against a couple of people who weren't sure about me, and I'll never forget that. He's a great guy, so I'd never have anything bad to say about him anyway, but I've always got a good word to say about Simon Clare because he really helped me.
So now poacher turned gamekeeper. A gamekeeper turned poacher, I should say.
Yeah.
Fast forward, how does this all come about?
The way the industry was going, I think it was inevitable that at some stage I'd move away from what I was doing. The requirement for old-fashioned odds compilers was dying, and I couldn't be that guy sat around managing a bunch of feeds and just managing customer accounts, and it was killing me the last couple of years. And I loved that job for the first 6 years. And people that would know me from Twitter would know that I was one of the biggest advocates of the betting industry around. I loved being a trader for a big company, and I loved everything that went with it. But more and more and more, the game just changed, and managing a team of odds compilers and traders the old-fashioned way was dying out, and there was no room for me. So I knew that this was the way that I'd have to go eventually. And in the only regret I've got, I think, is that I held on 2 years too long. I should have been here betting from home in my house 5 years ago rather than 2. But everything's easy in hindsight, isn't it?
That given, you must have realised that you had an aptitude for winning. So when did you realise that you're actually doing quite good as a punter?
Yeah, I think it was a very slow and gradual thing. So if we go back to those days I was living in Malta, I was punting, but at a low level, and was probably a break-even or a slightly losing punter back in those days. We're talking 2005, 6 here. and gradually, as I learnt from others, learnt from my own mistakes, and the biggest thing, learn how to. I think having a good opinion's one thing, but knowing how to handle it and manage yourself was every bit as important. And that was the real click for me, knowing that never to chase anything, never to bet after you've had a few beers, and you learn that in your 20s the hard way. And I think I was just in a position in my mid-30s where I became, or my early 30s, where I handled everything in a professional manner. Whereas in my 20s, I thought, here's my job, and I fancy myself to win a bit of money on the side, but it's to supplement my income rather than to be my main income. And I did that for a bit too long. I could have been a winning punter earlier, but that said, I wouldn't change anything for the world. I lived in Malta. I went out drinking every night. I had a great time in my mid-20s, and I socialised a lot. I had a lot of fun. But by the time I'm 31, 32, I didn't want to be like that anymore. And that was the time for me to take betting a lot more seriously.
So you are a winner. You do it now for a living full time. What's your angle?
The majority of what I do is Asian handicap betting on football. So I'll have an agent in Hong Kong who helps me get on. And the best part of that, because the biggest struggle I think that pro bettors have got in the UK at the moment, obviously, is getting on. It's not a problem for 95-96% of people out there. So we always have to look at this argument about what it's like getting on now, even-handedly, because yes, bookmakers are acting differently and making it harder and harder for us to get on. And some people are also getting caught in the crossfire there, that innocently break even, small winning, even small losing punters are losing accounts just because they happen to bet 50, 100 quid on something that's moving, that an arbor's also backed. And that's really bad long term for the industry. But we can't lose sight of the fact that that is still a relatively small number of people relative to those that are betting and getting on whatever they want. So what I do, Asian handicap betting, with a real sort of analytical and statistical background to the way that I form my prices, I find it easier to be able to get on in the size that I need in Asia. That's not to say that I always get on what I want. It absolutely isn't. The Asian market will open on a Monday morning for the following week, and I can't bet on a Monday morning because the maximum bets I can get with firms like SBO and firms that people talk about as being, the better layers out there, the pinnacles of this world, just don't have limits high enough on a Monday for me to bet the following Saturday's football on the leagues that I do. So I need to wait still until a Wednesday or a Thursday and hope that those prices that I've seen on a Monday are still there. And why the game's getting harder now is that those prices aren't there anymore. There are too many people that also know how to use modelling, statistical analysis to find the right price or something close to the right price that just weren't out there 7, 8, 10 years ago. When the biggest Asian handicap players around, your Blooms, your Benhams, got going, and this isn't to sound bitter at all, those guys are geniuses and they saw it before everyone else did, and they deserve everything they've got. But there was no competition to them, or there's so much less competition to them 10, 12 years ago than there would be now.
Okay, now also know that you're a family man with a young family. How do you cope with the pressure of that? Because you've got to feed them, you've got to keep a roof over their heads, you have a bad run on the Asian handicaps.
Yeah, pressure's an odd word. There is pressure, and you want pressure on yourself, I think, for me to be fully concentrated every day, because the only person that can motivate myself to work now is myself. I have no boss. I have no one to come and tell me, pull your socks up, you've slacked off the last few days. You've got to be able to do that yourself. And so it's that pressure to be able to win and provide for a family that I thrive on, really. But there's different types of pressure. I did what I didn't do now for a year. Between leaving Premier Bet and going to Stan James, I bet professionally for a year. But that was more poker than it was football betting in those days. I was a winning poker player for a few years. When poker was a very big game. I wouldn't win playing poker now. I don't play anymore. I stopped playing in about 2012 completely. But That year I played poker every day, 8-10 hours a day a lot of days, and made a decent income. I didn't get rich that year, that's for sure, but I made a solid enough income, mostly from playing poker. But I had very little. I was 25, 26 years old, and I'd only been working 4 years, so I had very little behind me cash-wise. And that's a very different type of pressure, to have to win to pay your rent each month. Now, that's my bills. All I had was rent and what I needed to go out and have a drink in a pub and go to football with my mates. So I wasn't looking after anyone else. I had no wife and kids back then, so all I had to do was win it for myself. But if you didn't win, you had no money. And that's where life's different doing it this time around, is that I'm fortunate that I've been working for 15 years and I've been a winning punter for 7 or 8 of those. So I've got some money behind me now, not to sound sort of arrogant or big-headed about it, but I can afford a 6-month losing run now. If I'd had a 6-month losing run when I was 25, I'd gone bankrupt. So it's a very different type of pressure. In terms of how I deal with losing runs, I think it's a really interesting question. And I'll start the response to that by talking about how I deal with winning runs, because I think the two things are linked. And I think it was Kipling, wasn't it, who said, if you can meet success and failure and treat those two imposters just the same, well, that's what you've got to do with winning and losing punting. When I have a big winning day or a big winning week, there's no big celebration. And I think this is what differs between professional punters and recreational punters, and so it should. If you're betting for a hobby and you have a great win, go and enjoy it. That's exactly what you should do. It just changes a bit when it's your only source of income and your form of making a living, because then you have to win and you have to have the odd big day. So when I see people out and about who call themselves professional gamblers who have a big win, and they're throwing money about and champagne here and there and trying to look like the big guy when they've had a big win, I think to myself, if that's how you act when you win, how do you act when you lose? Because for me, when I lose, don't get down. I can have this losing week. Losing weeks and losing months have to happen along the way. So when I have them, shrug my shoulders. I don't let it has to bother you a little bit, because you want it to bother you a little bit, but I don't go to bed sulking. And the missus, she knows when things aren't going well and when things are going well, because she knows me too well not to. But she'd also say that when I come out of this office and I go downstairs in the evening, we can stick some sort of documentary on or something and watch it, and I'll chill, even if I've had a horrible losing day. So the key to me is even-headed, and find little tricks to deal with your winning and your losing. One little trick I'd give people is, don't tot up your profit and loss on a day at the end of the day. Why do you need to know? If you've documented all of your bets, they're all there a week later. So go and tot up your profit and loss for a day a week later. When that day's gone, you've forgotten everything that's happened now, you've just dealt with everything today. Well, you realise you've lost $2,500 last Saturday a week later. Nothing you can do about it now. That's the numbers. You stick them on your spreadsheet and you move on to the next day. Knowing exactly to the penny what you've lost that day doesn't help you, just as knowing what you've won doesn't. So that's one trick I've taught myself, is don't go and add it all up on the same day. Just let it go, come back to it in a week's time, and there's your number. That's what happened. As long as you feel like the majority of the bets you had were the right bets and they've just lost, it's fine.